everyone. A massive welcome to the next edition, actually episode 11 of the CISO Experience. My name's Simon Linstead. I'm the host and the founder of the InfoSec Live community. And have we got another exciting event for you today? But before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. If you haven't watched us before, please do like and subscribe if you enjoy the content. And for those of you that don't know who the InfoSec Live community are, we've been around about a year now, founded by myself back in June last year. And we're a community of 3,000 cyber professionals sharing best ideas and practice in what I believe is the world's first dedicated security social network. And this show has been created to help further the sharing of best ideas and practice with our industry's leaders and beyond. And our community is free and always will be, and offers tons of support to our members. And this at the moment is only possible thanks to the support of our sponsor, Bramfit Technology Labs. So before we begin, quick bit about the sponsor who's making these possible. Bramfit are an international cybersecurity consultancy that lead the way in innovation and cyber resilience. Their entire team is owner managed and works on a linear structure, drawing expertise from the military, government, finance, and technology industry. And together they provide support and collaboration to those who protect company assets and sensitive data. They lead the way in technical cybersecurity consulting, focused on embedding a culture of security with their clients. And through research, education, and execution, Bramfit can help you to protect your systems and your reputation. And as the CEO, Lewis Bramfit, says, if you're a CISO suffering from Big Four fatigue, reach out to Bramfit today to see how they can help. I'll drop the link in the comments a bit later. But without too much further ado, let's do a quick intro for another amazing guest on the CISO Experience today. We have Joe Evangelisto coming on, who's an accomplished strategic IT executive with extensive experience in IT leadership, security, compliance, infrastructure, and operations. Currently the CISO at Tango Analytics, where he's helping them to redefine their security posture and culture. And previously, he spent over 20 years in the IT industry, transforming companies' cultures, processes, policies, and procedures, whilst building high-performing, empowered teams. And he brings a wealth of knowledge and experience, not only in IT, but also, and very importantly, in business and relationship management, spanning across government agencies, non-profits, healthcare industry, and technology. And along the way, he's earned his bachelor's and MBA in IT management from Western Governors University and holds CISSP. And in his free time, he goes on nature walks, a bit like myself, and is an amateur baker. Not so much of a baker, but I'm a big lover of the kitchen. Joe, great to meet you.
It's great to be here, Sam.
Did I get that right?
Yeah, absolutely. You nailed it. Good job.
So I suppose before we dig in, the whole point of this series is to try and help educate those who are watching, whether they're trying to break in or now about to be a CISO or already a CISO, trying to share the common themes, common best practice, and also the challenges and successes that you've had throughout your career. So I've given a really brief overview of it. Do you want to just take us back and give us a bit more info on how you got into the industry first?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back a ways back, honestly. So kind of how I started. I'm very fortunate in that the way I started in the IT industry in whole was out of pure luck. I was basically a secretary, an admin on a government contract, and the IT guy had left, and the other IT guy needed some help, and I just started pitching him. And he actually started training me and teaching me the ropes. And then from there, I was able to, parlay that into an actual IT job. And then it wasn't until, a couple years in that I actually went for my degree. So I did night classes for my degree, got my associates, did several years as a sysadmin, worked my way into management. When I got to management, it was, it needed a degree to continue to go down that path. So I went back to school again at night, WTU, and got my bachelor's. And at my wife's, behest and good idea, I went back and got my master's as well. And so from there, I was oftentimes doing a lot of infrastructure work, right? So I was leading IT teams, leading infrastructure teams, and all of that always had a component of security, right? You can't really get away from it, whether you want to call it a full-time security role or not. You're doing security in one shape or another, right? You're patching systems, you're trying to harden systems, you're trying to reduce, the ability of users to do things they shouldn't be doing, and so forth, right?
Yeah.
So really, one of my companies where they had not really done anything around security, at least not a dedicated effort, that I started running with that. And so with that came kind of the dual role of being both a director of IT and a CISO. And that's kind of how I broke in, right? It wasn't like I applied for a job and got it. It really was more, there was an opportunity at my current company where they had a hole, And I just stepped up and took it, right? And said, hey, look, we need to do this. Let me lead the effort, right? And along with that, after the effort was done, is when the CISO title came as kind of
Yeah.
a dual title, right? As a dual IT director and CISO. But it wasn't initially on their radar, right? They weren't looking for a CISO. They didn't even know they needed one. Didn't even know what it was all about. It really took me coming to them and saying, look, you have a hole. We need to fix it. And this is how we need to go about doing it, and just doing the work.
I think a couple of things to draw from that. Before I do, Deb's in the audience who says she remembers you then. Don't know if that's a good thing or not, Deb. You'll have to let us know in the chat. And secondly, your point about the multiple roles. Firstly, there seems to be a lot of CISOs even today, even in big companies, who are maybe not on paper doing more than a CISO role, but definitely in day-to-day life, being a CIO, a CTO, all sorts of different jobs, and sysadmin for some of them as well, and penetration testers, some of them I've spoken to. But a lot of them, I think probably half of them I've spoken to, have also come in a similar way to you. So not so much intentionally aiming for the CISO position, but kind of naturally progressing through it. And I think that's a reflection perhaps on where the industry was at the time. And unfortunately, a reflection on where some of the industry still is now with regards to that. And I speak to a lot of companies on a daily basis, not big companies, 100, 200 million turnover. And some of them haven't even engaged with security yet. And the big problem or the blocker that I see from a kind of non-technical perspective is that complete lack of awareness of where they need to start, because they think they need a pen test, which they should, surely do, but it's so much more than a pen test that they need. And then you open up Pandora's box and you become the one who's bearing the bad news, I've found.
It can go the way for sure, but I think what a lot of it comes back to is just education, right? They don't know what they don't know. Oftentimes, so my last 3 jobs have been in small companies, like 500 or less. And I think what you find there is that those places, they're really good at what they do, right? They're really good developers. They're really good, HR people. They have good CEOs who really understand the business, right? But if they've never actually thought about security or had a breach or had an incident or had an issue, it's not necessarily top of mind. If their board's not pushing it down on them, they're not really thinking about it. They hear about it, right? But it's almost that idea of like, well, that'll happen to someone else. It's not my problem. Or I don't have data they care about, right? And so usually the first step is having those conversations about like, all right, why do you need to care? What is it you actually need to protect? How can it be, stolen or breached? Or even if it's not being stolen, how can these things affect your business? And what does that look like? Or if none of those things are registering, at a very minimum, you can go, look, even if you may not care or think it doesn't apply to you, your customers do. Your customers are absolutely coming to you. And pushing on you.
Your brand reputation cares as well, doesn't it? And I think that the skill you're talking about there, which is one that I think is sadly lacking across many areas, is the ability to engage and explain those risks to the board, because there's a lot of misconceptions about what risks really are as well. And when you're talking in CEO language with risks, and then you're talking to someone in cyber with regards to risk, you're having like a completely different conversation. And I think sometimes, for me, that's one of the areas I see successful CISOs like yourself who do very well at that.
And it is a challenge. And I think for a lot of us, you tend to lean one way, you're better one way than another, right? So I will fully admit there are CISOs out there who are much more tactical than me, right? They understand the technical areas of security way better than I do. But they may not be as good at talking to their partners, right, as building those relationships. And that's something I feel like I excel at. So I think in the end, you have to find the area that best suits you. And I think there's actually a document out there that talks about the different archetypes of CISOs.
Yeah.
So the different types of CISOs there actually are. There's not just a one CISO fits all, right?
No, absolutely not.
Some companies need a more engineer.
That depends on the organizational fit as well, I suppose.
Absolutely. Depends on organizational fit, depends on, who the executive leaders are and what their skills are. It depends on what the company's selling. What does it do? All those things, reflect the type of CISO needs to be in that position. And I think oftentimes what we see, especially on the social media idea, is that if you're not, a kick-ass pen tester, then you can't be a CISO, right? If you're not able to do all these technical things that don't even drive being a CISO, and I think that's the wrong message to send. I think
Me
it's
too.
more about having a passion for security and want to protect the company, and then using your skills best to do that.
And also, as you rightly said, depending on the firm that you're working for, some CISOs need to get involved in the sales process because security is a lot more important in some industries and product types. You know, whether you're talking APIs or whatever you're talking about, there's a point where a CISO can become a valuable asset to the business with regards to being a sales tool as well.
Absolutely. And I can guarantee you that one of the first things I did at both my last two jobs, this one and the last one of the first things I had to do was review an RFP, review questionnaires, review security questionnaires, right? And help them answer those. And that is both a tell for, what is going to drive the business, right?
Yeah.
Customers want, security to be an active, vibrant part of that process. They want to make sure that they're being protected, their data is being protected, is being taken seriously. But it also, from my perspective, it's huge. It's very helpful. It gives me insight into, okay, where do we maybe have some weaknesses? Where are our answers maybe not where they should be? And then how can I then utilize that to then go back to the executives and go, okay, like we're struggling to answer these questions here. Why is that? Well, maybe because we don't have X, Y, or Z in place. Or maybe we're not doing these things like we should be doing. And so the answer is still a struggle. So that helps, give you that ability to kind of say, hey, we need to do this. And here's the reason why. This is not just me preaching it and saying is we have to do it, or some best practice thing saying what to do it. This is your customer who's expecting it from you. Yeah. And if you don't start doing it, you will start losing business.
Absolutely that. And I think, as Deb rightly said, providing value to the business is key. And rather than, do you know what? I've got a wasp in here. This is what live shows do for you. Let me get this wasp out gently out of the window. Hold on. Come on, fella. Let you go. There we go. Nearly. Not quite out the window, but he's gone. Sorry about that, folks. There we are. Disaster averted. So, going back to the adding value piece, there's one of the questions actually I was asked to ask, not just yourself, but other CISOs from some of the team members who I'm working with at the moment. And I think we've answered it already, which is more important for a CISO now? Is it those soft negotiation skills, or is it the technical ability? And I think you might have answered that by it being dependent on the role, perhaps.
It really does. It does depend on the role in the business. And let's be honest, like if you're a CISO at a company of 50, right, you've got to be technical. You got to be hands on keyboard, got to know what you're doing because, and you got to be able to identify what you can outsource, right? As it gets larger and your role gets bigger and you have more people under you, those skills, I think, become in some ways less important or less focused, right? It's like any other technical management job, right? I used to be a sysadmin. I used to be hands on keyboard, be able to do things and everything. When I started managing teams, that skill got pushed off, right? I had to try to remember it enough to be able to call BS on my staff or to challenge them or know how to work with them, right? But it wasn't what my job was every day. And I think CISOs are no different, right? Some, you're going to eventually move into hopefully a role if you want to, where you are doing more the business side of the house, where you're more on customer calls, you're more on business calls, you're more on board meetings and things like that. And if that's not something you want to do, if you want to stay more technical, then you need to actually go to companies that are smaller, right? Or go to companies that are going to value those skills and use them. So it's like anything else in your life. It's where do you want your career to go, and what is your skills, and how do you want to harness those?
Absolutely. And the other thing you said there was about technical assistance, so knowing where to outsource. And from all the people I've spoken to the last few weeks, it seems the ones who have strong connections and relationships with technical kind of consultants that they can draw that expertise from all the time, they seem to be crucial in these relationships, especially with firms perhaps who haven't got, excuse me, those internal resources to cope with some of the work that you need to do. And I suppose that goes back to my point again about the importance of networking and having a strong network of people around you. Off tangent a little bit. For the companies out there who haven't engaged with security, they've got a fairly decent turnover. They know they've got to do it. They want to do it, but they want to do it because they know they have to. What's the next step for these people? Is it a pen test first? Is it a consultation piece first? What do they do? Because they're all running around like headless chickens in the market. The SME sector at the moment is a bit of a mess. And what they all really want, unfortunately, and this I think is driven by the marketing messages that we see. One of the conversations I had earlier was, what I want is something that I can plug in and that I know is going to look after everything for me. And unfortunately, in the real world, Joe, we know there isn't anything magical that you can plug in
Right.
that does all that for you. So where would one of these companies start?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no silver bullet, and there never will be, right? And as things get more complex, it's just going to get worse. So, and I don't, I think it's almost the same way if you were to hire someone, what they should do, which is you got to do a risk assessment, understand, you got to understand what are the crown jewels you're trying to protect? Is it protected, right? A pen test is a part of it,
Yeah.
but maybe that's not the most important part you need to focus on. Maybe it's something completely different. So I think hiring a firm that can come in and do that kind of evaluation of like, okay, help me understand, what is it you do, right? How do you earn money? Because how you earn money tells me how I need to protect you, right?
Exactly.
Okay, now I understand that. What do you have in place today? And working through that, and then having them come back and say, look, based on our evaluation, here's what you need to do, right? You need to, shore this system up here. Maybe you need a pen test. Maybe they will recommend a virtual CISO or a part-time CISO because you're not ready for one. Because that's the other thing is I think sometimes companies they hear that they need one, and so they go and hire one before they're even ready for it. Yeah. And so now this person's coming in and trying to put in something in place that they're not ready as a culture, is not ready for that kind of level.
Well, this is the bit I'm talking about, because at the moment, what they seem to be doing in the marketplace is going to get a test done, having a look at the results, frantically try and scrabble around and patch as much as they can with limited resources over the next few months before then, deciding to then have another one. It just seems like it's all, excuse my terminology, arse about face, as we'd say here in the UK. So it's not a VC, so perhaps these people need to start with, but a consultation, I suppose.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that's undervalued in the industry is the value of procedures, right? And having things documented and standardized, right? Yeah. You get a pen test, you get results. If you're running around like crazy trying to resolve it, but never during that process kind of going, okay, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? How do we put in processes to make sure we keep those gaps closed and we stay on top of the things we're supposed to be doing? Then you're just going to go through it yet again, over and over and over again, right?
It's back to having the foundations in place. And Richard Phillips just dropped it in the comments. You need to know what you need to protect before you can protect it. So, I mean, that asset register is obviously of huge importance, as is everything else. But I don't know. We seem to be struggling as an industry to engage the smaller businesses effectively. Well, maybe not engage them effectively, but provide them with the correct solutions for what it is they want. And we seem to have, very, very expensive solutions up here that are great for blue chips and, FTSE NASDAQ firms, but not so good for SMEs. And it's trying to find something that I suppose fits into that, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And I run into this a lot, right? Where, I've actually specifically started going to conferences that are focused on small, medium-sized businesses and not the large ones, right? Everyone's like, oh, you go into Black Hat, you go to DEF CON. It's like, no, right? I'm sure they're a lot of fun. I'm sure there's some good information there and some value. But when you're a company of 300 and your budget is much, much smaller and you're still trying to convince them of what they need to do and bring things along, coming in with a company that's going to say, oh, yeah, we can do all that for like $500,000, I'm going to get laughed out of the room.
Not
right?
happening, is it?
So, I really have to work with what I have. And oftentimes that's with, unknown companies, people who are just starting up, people who are trying to break in, right? It's a bit risky at times, right? Maybe I get it right and we get a good company and they take off. Maybe I get it wrong, right? But you got to kind of, work around what you have. And to your point, like there's every day, I don't know how many new cybersecurity companies start up every day. It's insane.
Well, there's 3,500 products in our market at the moment. And I had this conversation with, I think it was Jack Jones from the Fair Institute last week or the week before. And we were talking about, no, it wasn't. It was Ido Gaynor from CISO Experience, where we were talking about the state of the market and how it's still a very immature market. Despite there's been people in it for 20, 30 years, the market as itself is kind of at a saturation bubble point, which happens in every kind of, I suppose, early stage market where you get masses of stuff before it gets to a point where it starts to slim down and then you start to make sense of it. And I think maybe the recession we're now about to step into might help with that, maybe not in a positive way, but there's been an awful lot of money thrown at startups by VCs and PEs over the last couple of years. And it does, with my finance background, it smacks of the tech boom a little bit with regards to the lack of due diligence, perhaps, on some of these purchases. But
No,
I take my advisor hat off because I'm not authorized anymore. So that's just personal opinion. Just clarify that.
no, I got you. I got you. And I wouldn't disagree with that at all. And I think Richard Phillips he brings up a good point, which is, at the end of the day, most companies all need the same thing, and this is just a scale issue, right? And the problem is when you're trying to solve a problem by buying a product, if it's a point product and it's expensive, the likelihood of a small company buying that point product is probably not going to happen, right?
No.
You need to get the most bang for your buck. So I'm oftentimes looking at things that give me multiple benefits, right? Maybe it doesn't do the second or third thing I need to do as well as a different product, but it does it. And it comes at a lower cost point, right? So it means I can get more out of it than I would if I went with 5 different products. And oh, by the way, the more products I buy, the more people have to manage those products, and the more complex the environment gets.
Well, this is another thing that keeps coming up with all the CISOs I speak to about when they arrive at a new firm on day one. It's the legacy of products, not only that they've got that they aren't using, but it's the ones that they are using, but they're only using 10% of, or the fact that the staff aren't trained on any of it and don't know what they're doing, and they're paying Christ knows how much money out for all of these things every year. And it's just a bit of a mess. But the way the industry fixes that at the moment is another company comes along and says, "Hi, Joe, I've got something else for you to plug into that stuff you've got there. So if we just plug that into that," and it's just turning into a bit of a nightmare, isn't it?
Yeah. And you brought up a good point, which is, we talked a lot about like actual security tools and the problems those house, but really it's any business tool, right? The company decides they're going to implement Salesforce. Well, have they thought about who's going to administer it? Who's going to maintain it going forward? Because if you don't have that in place, that can open up that opens its own set of risks, right?
Absolutely.
That no one thinks about, right? And when you have different parts of the company who are just going off and doing their own thing without someone in IT or security being involved, it really can put you at a really big risk.
They're bringing in extra third-party risks left, right, and center every time they bolt something on, aren't they? Whether it's a sales tool or an API or whatever it is, it's one problem after another. And I see Richard's jumped in again. All defense is the same, whether home, business, or country. It's just a case of scale and offering a sense of what's valuable. And do you know what? Back to your point about giving people a chance who are either new to the industry or, not a massive firm. Richard Phillips is actually a member of the InfoSec Live community, very good friend of mine as well. And also, trying to say this politely, Richard and I are of an older generation. And I think, despite going slightly grey, us older generation do bring something else to the table. And Richard's been trying to break in now for the last year. And his age has become a bit of a barrier for him. And it's really, really frustrating for him and for me watching it, because the guy's been dealing with people for like 35 years. He picks up things this quickly. And if a firm would just give someone like him a chance, rather than some of the people who've got... Splodge has just put, he's an old fart. Thanks, Splodge. He's not, because he's my age, Splodge. He's a spring chicken. I think that the industry is a little bit blinkered, but again, it's difficult for firms, especially those who've got tons of work coming in, and they need qualified bums on seats straight away. And because of the way the industry is under pressure at the moment, I think we're seeing more of that, where firms are being forced to recruit kind of wheel them in and ready technical people and also other people. And it's just going to get worse if they keep doing that. So what's the answer, Joe?
I don't think there is an easy answer, because you're right. And I've been in a position where I've needed to hire someone to handle security, right? And I have basically two options. I could hire someone who comes in and day one can pick up and run with stuff, right? Yeah. Or I could take the route of saying, you know what, let's bring in someone who's a little more junior and train them up. And there's pros and cons to both, right? And which way are you going to go? I elected to go the junior route, right? Now, why did I go that route? Well, I kind of rationalized with myself. I said, well, the ramp up time is probably not so bad, right? It's probably 6 months. In that 6 months, can I step up a little more and help out and do some things? Absolutely, right? Yeah. Does that mean the person I'm getting will hopefully stay longer? Absolutely, right? Give someone an opportunity, give them a chance to learn. They're probably going to stay longer than a year. They're probably going to stay a couple of years, maybe 3 or 4, before they're ready to move on into their next step, right? But if you keep bringing in people who can hit the ground running day one, in a year they're bored, right? Because they can already do the job. You're not challenging them at all. And so I think it's about reality of like, and sometimes you don't have that option. Sometimes you are at a position where like, I don't have time to train one, or I can't train, or I don't have the skills to train someone, or the business at a critical point where we need that person to be able to hit the ground and go. But I do think, we all too often take the easy route as opposed to, or maybe a little bit harder route, and train people. And I do that mainly because, again, going back like I started, I was very fortunate to be trained at a very young age on what to do, right? Without my mentor, Kevin Donovan, if he hadn't helped me out, if he hadn't spent time with me explaining what a hard drive was and how it functioned and work and all this stuff, like, I would never be where I am today. And so I try to take that at heart when I look at, when I'm trying to hire people, what I try to do, and I will say I'm not perfect at it, right? There are times where maybe I don't, give people the opportunity maybe they deserve. I do definitely try for that reason, for sure.
But like you said, it's hard when you've got the pressures of needing to get stuff done. And I'm hoping the InfoSec Live community can start to help bridge that gap a little bit. I mean, we've managed to get some sponsorship now. I haven't announced it yet, and I can't formally, but starting in September, we've got a US-based recruiter who's jumped in and offered to sponsor 2 or 3 members to put them through their exams over the course of 9 to 12 months. So what we're looking to do is provide free support and training. So there's a plethora of stuff out there on YouTube, Google, everywhere for free, but it's a minefield. And for those breaking in, like myself a couple of years ago, it's overload. So we're trying to do something with a chap called Jason Shockey, who's a CISO in New York. He's got a company called My Cyber Path. And he's put together a profiling tool, basically, that helps you line yourself up to roles that you'd find interesting, match your profile. And I think that's where a lot of people are going wrong. I made that mistake. So I got excited by wanting to be a James Bond villain and being a pen tester. That's what happened in my head. And I'm blaming the marketing and my upbringing for that. But I think a lot of people are the same, where they see SOC analyst or pen tester and they're coming in for that, when really, if I'd have looked at my skills before, I never would have thought I could do a job where I sit in front of a laptop 12, 14 hours a day, because I've got ADHD and I fidget. I have to be wandering around and doing stuff. So that's the first step. And it's then trying to map out through speaking to recruiters and people like yourselves on what qualifications actually work. And we've got to the point, I think ISC Squared have just brought in like an entry level exam, which in the UK, they're giving 100,000 away for free. So we're going to use that as kind of the entry point, and then looking at whether it's A+, Sec+, Net+, or whatever else you then start to fill the gaps, and then having labs, etc., and support mechanisms. And I'm hoping we can build all this out so people can not get ripped off by boot camps, because that's a huge bugbear of mine as well, especially people transitioning from the military who get a nice allowance that, funnily enough, equates to exactly the same amount of a cost for a 12-week boot camp, which seems a little bit ironic. But the amount of horror stories, Joe, I hear from people, don't get me wrong, I've heard some good ones, and there is a time and a place for a boot camp. Let me just clarify this before people start ripping me apart. So I've done boot camps before in financial services when I was looking to upskill on my knowledge before an exam. Give you an example, tax and trusts. Awful subject, one I hated. So I booked in for a 4-week boot camp before the exam to kind of reaffirm and boost up the existing knowledge I've already got. So I think if you're an existing professional and you want to do a boot camp, whether it's to get your CISSP or whatever it is, they can work. But when it comes to someone who's a new entrant with no IT knowledge, to turn around and tell them that they can be an expert in 12 weeks is just a lie, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And actually, I've helped out with a couple of local universities and talked to a bunch of younger people. And what we always tell them is, look, at the end of the day, this, that certificate, right, that, you've gotten, it may get you the interview, but it's not going to get you the job, right? The job is going to be based on your ability to do the work, right? Not to recite the definition of, whatever the term is, right? And I think that's an important factor to understand. So for them, it's more important to, do internships, to work the skills you have. I was talking to a gentleman the other day who worked for me. He wanted some career advice. And I said, oh, that's good. We went and had coffee. And the thing I pushed him, I was like, look, you know the path you want to go. The best way to do that is to leverage opportunities at your current job. If there's a project coming up that takes you there, volunteer. Be the first one in line to ask to do that work, right? Or if you can't do the work, ask the person who's doing it to like go alongside them, and put in that extra effort. That's going to help you learn things in a way that a boot camp's never going to.
And you're not the first person to say that, because let's not forget, it's much easier for a firm to recruit in-house than it is to start going. I mean, I've seen what the fees are like in America for recruitment. I mean, I thought they were expensive over here, but my word, there's some people earning some money over there, Joe. That's for sure. Splodger's made a good comment about people from different industries and people pivoting in. that one, they could be more dynamic, and I agree with that completely, and also bring in that alternative view. And going back to the more dynamic bit, if I use a sales analogy back to, I suppose, when I started sales when I was 16, and I had a sales manager and I was selling mobile phones. And what they want is they want to know that you're driven. So they want to know that you've got a car on finance, or, a baby, or whatever it is. They want to know that you've got a reason for working. And I think with a lot of people who are coming into the industry, it isn't, different motivations, but the motivations are there. They've got a point to prove. They've got, as you said earlier, they want that career progression. Whereas if you get someone who's already qualified, they're on 150 grand, whatever it is a year, they're coasting along doing 25 hours work a week. You're never going to get, no disrespect to anyone who's doing that, by the way, then you're never going to get as much out of them as you are someone who's perhaps more hungry.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That passion is going to drive lots of things, right? It'll drive change within the company. It's also going to challenge you as a leader, which I think sometimes people shy away from.
Yes.
But it's important, right? It's important to have someone come in and challenge you a little bit, and push you to rethink maybe the things you've always thought that's how they should be done, or the way you should look at things, right? And without that, you can also, as a leader, get very, just settled in your ways of doing things, and then you don't learn and grow. And then you're in the same spot as anyone else would be if you don't continue to learn and grow, right? Doesn't necessarily mean you have to grow up the ladder, right? But you still have to grow in what you know and understand.
Absolutely. Just a quick bit of housekeeping. For those that don't know, I live on the middle of a farm, and our house is surrounded by fields. And unfortunately, we've got the world's biggest combine harvester out the back of our house at the moment. So if you start to hear some awful loud noise, it's fine. Everything's under control, and the children are indoors. Chimeri, you've made a comment. Simon dropping down like Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible. Not quite sure what that was. If you could clarify that point, that would be great. Going back to the main point, which we haven't even got to yet, is your successes and challenges. And let's start on the successes. Talk to me about what you're proudest of, Joe.
I mean, I think what I'm proudest of is the last two places I've worked. I basically have come in and helped them, really set a foundation that they can build from, right? It's coming in and cleaning things up. It's kind of what I feel like I'm good at, right? It's that idea of being able to take things that aren't organized, process driven, based on policy, have no real strategy or trajectory. They're just doing stuff, right? And really getting on a pathway that says, okay, like we're going to move this forward at a very, prescribed pace. We're going to have goals. We're going to mature and go from doing things ad hoc to doing things based on processes and abilities, and get those things to a point, and getting to a point where then the next person is ready, and they're ready to make that next step to be way more technical, way more proactive, and less reactive, and so forth. And I feel like that to me is what I'm proud of, is that being able to build that foundation to where they are at a place that they can feel proud of their security offerings, right? To be actually able to go to their website and say, look, here's what we do. Here's our security. Here's all the things we do, because now it's a source of pride, as opposed to something, don't look here because we don't have anything to show you.
I think it's a business enabler if it's done correctly. It's something that you can shout about and be proud of, that you've got that security culture in place, and it reassures all of the clients who are dealing with the firm that their clients and their data is safe, which is hugely important. And I noticed, I don't know if you know Chris Carey. I don't know you, Chris. We haven't met before, but thanks for dropping in the comment. I'm just going to pull it up now. He said that, I take it you do, Joe, do you?
Yeah. I do. Yeah, we're together. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Too many companies are missing essential documentation and can't plan to protect because everything happens in a silo. And this is back to my three least favorite words from financial services, which is governance, risk, and compliance. And I suppose the bit I've been alluding to through people starting with pen tests, where do you need to start, is so important, isn't it? To have that framework in place and make sure you've got, your risk assessments done, your redundancy in place, your DLA, your business disaster recovery plan, all these things that, again, some companies have, I won't say templated answers to these, but perhaps in some industries it's used as a box tick. But again, these documents shouldn't be seen, in my opinion, as a box tick, because you can add real value through going through this process. Do you think?
Absolutely, and I 100% agree with that. I think what ends up you're absolutely right. People can take these things, use them as a check the box, and walk away, right? But I think the opposite is true too. You can use these to drive the business where it needs to go, right? So one of the things I do when I'm trying to come into a place is go, okay, what is the standard we're adhering to? What is it we want? What is our goal? And what are we trying to accomplish? Right? What are we trying to get to? All right, great. We want to get here. Where are we now? Well, we're down here. So how do we get there, right? And we put together a plan, and we define what are our policies, what are the things we are going to do, right? And then, okay, now we define what we're going to. What aren't we doing that we say we're going to do, right? We say we want to do pen testing annually. Are we doing pen testing annually? No. Okay, so now you actually have something they've agreed to. So executives agree to it. They agree to what you want to do. They agree to where you want to go. They've signed off on the policies. And now you can use that as a way to drive forward the other pieces, the change you want to make, right? It's like, okay, we're now going to move forward to doing these things. But they start to push back, whoa. You said this was important. You agreed this is what you want to do. These are the policies you signed off on. So either we're going to do things to meet those, or what was the point of the effort, right?
We call that in sales closing doors.
Absolutely, yeah.
Objection handling, I suppose, getting rid of those objections before they come. But I think if you've done your job properly in the first place and you've helped them understand the risks in a way they understand, and they can equate to dollars, which seems to be what drives most of them, I think then you're on a winner, aren't you? So we've talked about the successes. What about the challenges? I mean, I can't expect you to talk about personal challenges within the business because it's sensitive, but let's perhaps talk about the challenges as an industry as a whole at the moment.
So I'll look at it from my perspective, which is I'm a CISO at a small company, right? Which means there's this idea that I'm an expert at everything, right? So I'm an expert in code, application and code testing and code hardening and secure best practices there. I'm an expert at hardening systems, and I'm an expert in encryption and all these other things, right? Which is just not feasible, right? I can't be. Unless I've been doing this job for 60 years and done each one of those things individually, it's just not possible. So I think the challenge is that, right? Is that feeling of like, all eyes are on me, that I better have the answers and I better know exactly what we're supposed to do and do it now. And if I don't, right, maybe I'm not the right man for the job, right? So it's a bit of imposter syndrome, but I don't want to use that word too heavily. I think it's more just the challenge of there's a huge amount of skills and knowledge you're supposed to have that is very hard to do, right? And so it's about, like you mentioned, being able to leverage a network to help you with that. And I know I do almost on a weekly basis, right? And on my network does the same thing. But I think that is the biggest challenge, especially for, I think, a CISO at a small company, because I don't have teams to reach out to, right? I don't have a SOC team. I don't have a pen testing team. I don't have security admin teams. I have maybe one other person, and we're together trying to do security across the entire company and across all facets of security. That is a huge challenge for anyone, I think, in the role.
I mean, from what I see with Bramford Technology Labs, who I'm working with at the moment, they deal with enterprise level clients predominantly. But even with that size, the CEO and his technical team, I would say, are as much of a sounding board as they are technical consultants. That they're being pulled on calls that you could argue are a little bit outside of our remit. But when you've got that trust built up and those existing relationships, that is super, super important. And again, going back to my bugbear about marketing budgets and, the messaging in the industry at the moment not helping perhaps on people getting budgets, because the term cybersecurity expert is one that I particularly get irritated by, because it's like people saying, I want to break into cybersecurity. And you say, well, what job? And they go, I don't know, just cyber. So if you say you're a cybersecurity expert, I don't believe you, because I don't think anyone can be an expert on such a broad topic. So I think, again, the terminology that's being used perhaps doesn't help. Let's talk about buzzwords then. So I went to my first cyber InfoSec conferences this year, went to RSA in San Francisco and went to InfoSec Europe in London. And it's a lot of, you mentioned you'd gone to some smaller ones. I can see why, although I have got lots of free T-shirts, some socks, slippers, and more stickers than you can imagine, which my children were happy with. The messages...
I still get those. Okay, I still get those.
Oh, see, I'm missing out. The messages seem to have a similar theme running through them. So you had shift left everywhere, and you had zero trust, which is the other popular terminology in the industry. Now, shift left is a topic, I suppose, close to my heart in a way, because that's what Bramford do, application security. Mm-hmm. And I know how frustrated they are with the terminology, for the simple reason that no one's really shifting left, it seems, when they use that terminology, but they want you to stay and use their SAST and DAS scanners, perhaps.
Yep. Yep, absolutely.
Is that
Yeah, and,
cynical?
it's unfortunate because sometimes these terms, they mean well, right? The whole
Yeah,
concept behind 15 left, it makes sense. It's what
it
you
does.
should be doing, what you want to do, right?
Yeah,
But it gets overused to the point that it becomes almost annoying. And I think zero trust is getting to that point now as well, where it's like
yeah.
when it first came out and was being bandied about, everyone's like, "Oh, that's a really interesting concept, and how do we do that?" And there was these good conversations going on. Now it's a buzzword that companies are using to try to sell their product. Well, we now help
Yeah.
you do zero trust, and you're like, do you, or you just
Yeah,
do
but
a
they've
component of
got AI as well, and if they've got AI,
it? Yeah,
you're in.
yeah. So I think it's like anything else in the world, right? Which is you gotta like read between the lines, move
Yeah,
all the marketing speak, get down to brass tacks. Like, all right, what is it you really are doing? What is it really offering to me? Is it something I really need? What are my requirements even? Right? And I think oftentimes we don't understand what even our requirements are, so we're trying to buy something to fill a hole, and we don't know what the hole is. Then we get it, and we're like, well, what do we do with this now? Right?
completely agree. Yeah, it's difficult. Although you say about sorting the wheat from the chaff, I suppose, with all the products. I've spoke to two people recently who are retired CISOs who now do that as a full-time job. So they work with the
Yeah.
CISO in enterprise level firms, and their job is to sift through the noise in the industry, the products, and try and find partnerships and solutions that actually work. And I see that role becoming bigger and bigger and more prevalent as with the BISO role that I only found out about a few weeks
Yeah.
ago because I'm so naive and new. But again, that seems to bear a lot of relevance to the right kind of firm. I mean, again, it's got to be the right industry, it's got to be the right organization. But again, could you argue that if you had the right CISO in place, you wouldn't need a BISO? Or do you need both? It depends on the size, I suppose.
I
Complexity.
think that is a size thing. I think for sure, right? It's for example, I worked at a large company, 5,000 employees, right? And one of the roles they had there were they were called business partners, and the business partner was meant to sit between IT and the business, right? They eventually had dotted line to the business. They helped the business understand IT, understand like this is what we offer, this is what they do, this is how they help you. And they helped the IT understand the business needs and it
Yeah.
helped really bridge that gap. And it was actually a very important role to make sure things were moving forward on both sides, right? That the IT was actually meeting the business's needs and not just running forward whatever initiative they had, right? And help make sure that the business was actually taking advantage of the services IT was offering.
I
And the
think we
BISO
hear
role
a
is
lot
similar
about
now.
the need for the CISO to deal with the C-suite, but we don't hear as much about the need for the IT team and the people under the CISO to understand the business objectives, like you said before, how they make money, what's going to be a business blocker. Because if they don't understand that, and why would they? Because they're
Yeah,
technical people, not business people. If they haven't got that understanding, that's where you get the animosity between development
absolutely.
teams, security teams, or whoever it might be, because they don't understand why they're being told to
Yeah,
do what they're being told.
exactly.
And the other issue that's come up a lot is we've seen a lot of work, developer work, outsourced, in particular to India recently, and some really big firms have kind of closed down their own developer departments and outsourced that whole thing, which in my opinion, is great from an initial off the budget kind of cost saving. But I do worry about the inherent risks that brings with it, where you've got multiple people dragging stuff in from different repos. You know,
Yep.
it just seems like a bit of a disaster to me. Is that something you've ever had to deal with, or?
Yeah, I mean, every company I've been at has some sort of, partner company they're working with, whether it be out of India or local or whatever. It's still someone who doesn't work for you, right? They work for you under a contract, right? But not your employee. So it's always a concern whenever you outsource work of any type.
Yeah,
And so you just have to, it just becomes part of your vendor management process, right? You have to define, okay, if we're going to hire a firm to do work for us, here's what we require them. Here are the security requirements we have of that firm. They have to meet these. If they can't meet these, they're not going to work for us. And oh, by the way, it's not just that simple, right? We're going to monitor them, we're going to manage it, and so forth. And it's tricky to get that in place, especially when you come to a company where the relationship already exists.
yeah,
So you're coming in after the fact, contract's already signed, so you don't have a lot of leverage, right? To say, well, you have to do this. They go, well, it's not in the contract, right? So now you have to instead appeal to some other nature, right? You have to appeal to their sense of like wanting to continue the business contract, wanting to do the right thing, and so forth. And that's always a bit hard. And that's where I think the social aspect of being a CISO is so important. That ability to have those kind of conversations, to communicate in a way, and win that trust, and win that commitment from people is huge, and that is all soft skills. That has nothing to do with your ability to pen test, right? That has everything to do with your ability to make a connection with someone, have those hard conversations, and work through things to get that in place.
So where have you got these soft skills from, Joe? Does it date back to your childhood? I mean, it all comes from somewhere. And the point I'm trying to get to with this, before I make you say the wrong thing, is I get it a lot where people say, it's all right for you. You're natural at this. Well, I'm only natural at it because I was knocking on people's doors at 11 trying to wash their cars. And then at age 15, I've always tried to do something to make money, I suppose. I've been quite driven entrepreneurially since I was a teenager. So you naturally pick up and learn those interpersonal skills. And I suppose the active listening is something that seems to be really missing out on lots of conversations. And I suppose I think it's a combination of two old Greek words, dialogue, and a dialogue is where two people are actually having a conversation about a common theme they're interested in, actually listening to what each other say, like I hope we are doing at the moment, rather than a conversation, which is where someone's just talking at someone else and they're sitting there sort of waiting for their moment to jump in and say what they want to say, which seems to happen a lot.
No, agreed. I will say, I think there is a bit of with anything in life, you have areas where you just have natural abilities, right? And you have some, something where you're comfortable, right? But I think there's also a point where you have to understand that, right? You have to look at yourself and kind of go, all right, what am I good at? What am I comfortable doing, right?
Yeah.
And those are your strengths, right? They can be, and again, for me, that's not pen testing, right? I'm not a pen tester. I'm not a coder, right? If I were to go down that path, I would fail miserably because it's not something I would enjoy. And it's not something where my brain thinks the way it needs to do that kind of work. And vice versa, right? You can't force yourself. But it doesn't mean you can't learn, right? It doesn't mean I can't understand what the job is and how it functions and the importance of it and have those skills. The other part, I think, is, so I guess for me, it's a couple of things. So one is I read a lot. I read a lot about,
Me too,
and not necessarily books, but just articles around leadership and ways to lead and good management and what it looks like and all the things you need to do to be a good manager. And I think it's all important, right? The other piece is, and I heard this once before, I think it's a very interesting idea, and I think it's true, which is people always say you parent how you were parented to a degree, right? You make adjustments based on I don't want to do this the way my parents did. I want to do something different. But in the end, you will have some consistency of how you were raised, right? Because you can't help it. That's how it was handled. Yeah. And I think management's very similar. You manage how you were managed, right? And so if your whole life you've always had the same type of manager, then that's how you learn, right? That's how you go, this is how it's done.
Yeah.
That's how they do it. So
although my flip argument to that, and I can say this because my mum's pretty old and she's not going to be watching YouTube, but I probably didn't have the most loving upbringing. My adoptive parents sent me to private school. They threw money at me as a solution, and that was kind of what I had growing up. And my learned behavior from that is what broke me in the end, because I was brought up thinking that money counts. So it was all about the money. And it took for me to get to 4 years ago where I kind of, pretty much had a breakdown and lost everything to realize that perhaps it wasn't. So you can unlearn. I suppose one is you can unlearn those behaviors. And the second point is being an adopted only child has driven me to try and be the best dad. I mean, getting away from cyber here, I try to be the best dad I can because I never really had that when I was growing up. So I think, learned behaviors are hugely important, but also we can learn from our mistakes as well, as much as we can from perhaps the good bits, and also perhaps from some of the mistakes we see other people make as we get older anyway, because when you're younger, you never listen, do you?
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. And it's not to say you can't change or you're unable to change, but oftentimes what you find is the change comes at a point where something dramatic happens that causes change, right? Or you have to, purposely say, look, I'm not going to do this, or I'm going to be this kind of person. And you have to work at it, right? It's not a one-time thing, I've made a decision, it's done, right? No. And that could be anything. That could be hey, I'm going to be a boss who's more positive, right? I'm going to make sure I'm recognizing my employees on a regular basis. You can say it all you want, but if you don't actually put it into practice and do it on a regular basis, you're never going to do it, right? So I think it's a bit of learned. It's a bit of you trying to make sure you're going down the right path and doing the right thing.
So. I think it's learning to say no as well. It's probably one of the biggest mistakes I made when I had my own business was just saying yes to a lot of stuff. And I think that's one of my biggest learning points is where now because I have this inherent need to be liked by people, which I now understand, I can now take a step back before I make a decision and actually think, well, am I doing this because I want him to say, oh, you're a nice bloke, Simon, thanks for that? Or am I doing this because it's going to benefit me and the family? And I think, that maybe comes with age and mistakes, perhaps. I don't know. Splodge, you made another good one there. You got a question for Joe. What's the thought on the phrase, love this one, we don't have the bandwidth? To me, it states you can't be bothered to sort your issues out. I take it, Splodge, you've had a recent problem like that by the sounds of it. Any thoughts, Joe?
I think that's where you have to have a conversation with the person, right? If I go to you and say, "Hi, I need you to do X," and you're like, "Oh, I don't have the bandwidth to do that." It's like, okay, let's talk through this. Is it like you don't have the bandwidth now, or you won't ever have it, right?
Yeah.
Is it going to be soon? What can we do to make this a more priority? Do I need to get this prioritized? How
There's
do
the
I
word.
work through that? Right?
That's the word. Yeah. Priority, isn't it? Yeah.
It is a
being able
conversation.
to communicate and help them understand where that sits in their list of priorities. And if you can scare the bejesus out of them, Splodge, and make them realize they've got to do something, I'm not encouraging that. But, it is a part of it, isn't it?
Yeah, and oftentimes what they really are trying to say is like, look, I don't have enough resources. I don't have enough staff. And the staff I have are overworked and have too much on their plate. So no, I can't take on something new, right?
Yeah.
In which case you go, okay, can I help you make the argument for more staff, right? Do we need to sit down and figure out a way to make that pitch so you can get the bandwidth you need back so you can do the work I need to get done, right? It is, and then oftentimes it requires you to help someone that eventually will have a benefit for you, but may not upfront, right?
Yeah.
Upfront, it's a lot of work, to do that kind of conversation. And oftentimes what you'll find is the person is going to be defensive, right? They're going to be like, what? Why you're into my business? No, I told you no, I don't have time for this. Go away. And you're like, you got to work with that and work through that. Because oftentimes they will get defensive thinking you're trying to, attack them or bring them down.
Tenacity is hugely important, I think, as a skill, perhaps, Joe. I think, again, you mentioned the word. I kind of stuck my fingers up as you said it. Priorities. And even top business leaders are very good at being busy. And I think we can all be guilty of that sometimes as well. And the only way, in my old-fashioned way, that I deal with that is that I have a notebook that I write a list in before I go to bed at night. And then in the morning, I'll go through the list, see if there's anything else to add to it, and try and put it in some semblance of order of priorities, that things that need doing first, rather than putting all the ones that need doing that I don't want to do down at the bottom. I try and force myself to get the uncomfortable tasks done first, so the rest of the day is easier. I mean, that's my way of managing it. But Richard Phillips also said he was advised to be a good manager and always seem to be fair. I think that's a fair point. Strong, firm, but fair, as my elderly mother would say, perhaps.
Yeah, and I would say consistent.
Consistent. Yeah, very good. And Splodge says they just need to look at my face, Simon. Well, I don't know what to say to that, Splodge. You've told me I'm old earlier. I don't know. I still love you, though, and appreciate you tuning in. So we've got 5 minutes left. Final thoughts, then, for those maybe a bit like yourself who used to be sysadmins, now looking to take that next step. If there isn't anything internal within their organizations, what would you do if you were them now to further your career?
So I know everyone talks about it, but it's still hugely important. That's network, right? Yeah. Reach out to your network. The other thing I'll say is get involved in some sort of local chapter, whether it be ISC Squared or ISACA or something. Those can be hugely beneficial. I know I'm lucky where I'm at in the Raleigh-Durham area. The ISACA group here is really great. They're very good at helping both younger people and other people get into the industry and help each other out with internships and stuff like that. They even put in their own security conference. So I think there's some opportunities there. And I do think mentoring, having a mentor, someone who will help you down that path is huge. I have a mentor still, right? I still have guys that, like, if I have a decision I need to make, whether it be a business decision or a career decision or whatever, I have a group of people I reach out to and say, hey,
let me clear something up quickly then. Terminology again, right? Coach or mentor. Now, to me, a mentor isn't paid. Am I right or wrong?
I've seen it both ways is what I'll say. I've seen places actually try to essentially, monetize mentorship.
Right? I think coaching's monetizable, and I think there's a place for it. I just think with mentoring, the whole ethos behind that relationship isn't one that's driven by money or shouldn't be driven by financial profit. And it's super hard because the most valuable commodity we've all got is time. So
Yeah,
to get people to give up that time, I think it's back to your point about the need to network and build up those relationships, and also be really choosy as to who you look up to and who you spend time with. Because the other thing I've seen, people who are trying to break in, they say want to be a SOC analyst, misguidedly perhaps, or whether they really do, but they get a mentor who's, a pen tester or someone else because they've paid for the service. And you then see them in a year's time thinking, I've done this and I've done that, and I've got to a point where I don't really want to be. And I think again, it's making sure you're speaking to the right people and taking the right advice, and not being led by advice that's paid for all the time. And I know that's a horrible thing to say. We all need to earn money, but this
sure.
industry is it's like no other when it comes to the amount of people who are prepared to give back. Financial services certainly
Absolutely.
wasn't like that. I can tell you that for nothing. There's so many people willing to give back, and it's not just the InfoSec Live community. There's so many out there. You've got Simply Cyber, Outpost Grey, Cyber Mentor Dojo. There's just loads. Whole Cyber Human Initiative, or another one helping veterans in the States. I think you've got VetSec, Tech
Sure.
Vets, for those transitioning as well. The support is out there, but it's trying
Yes.
to get through the noise to find out which support is best. And I suppose my final point for anyone looking to pivot into the career is to make sure you've assessed your own skills and your own goals. And when I say goals, I'm not talking about financial goals. I mean, to me, success isn't a destination. It's clearly a mindset. And we all spend our lives, from primary school or junior school, looking forward to going to high school, and from high school, looking forward to go to college, then the next job, then the promotion. It's always something else we're spending our lives looking forward to. I realized a few years ago that actually what's important is enjoying what you do now. So, again, for those looking to come into the industry, make sure the job you're training up for is going to be the one that you want to do. And there's more than two roles in this industry. There's, for people like myself who I suppose are gobs on stick and talk a lot, you've got sales, marketing, community development. There's lots of different opportunities, but take the time
Absolutely.
out and make sure you've aligned that first, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. You definitely have to look within first. You have to understand what your skills are, what you're comfortable doing, what you're good at doing, what you want to do. Where's that going to lead you? All those things matter. And sometimes having someone to talk that through with, whether it's a paid coach or whether it's a mentor who's willing to spend time with you, is important.
Yeah.
And again, I can't emphasize that enough. Having a mentorship and having a network. I use my mentors when I have decisions to make or need guidance, and I have a network when I have just questions that I need answered, like, "Hey guys, how does this function or work? Because I've never experienced this before." And you're right, this community does give back more so than any other community in IT I've ever been a part of, but it is finding the right version of it, right?
It is.
People who are actually there to help each other out, and
And
oftentimes they're not the ones speaking the most.
you also, yeah, completely that. Very much so. If I've learned anything the last few weeks, it's the amount of people out there who are doing amazing work for amazing companies. You never see them on social media because they're too busy. And the ones you do see on social media all day have got far too much time on their hands, perhaps. And let me just clarify something else. I think there is a time and a place for paying for coaching. I really do. And I think it can help a lot of people. But mentoring, I think, is a little bit different. And again, I don't think one mentor is always enough either. And I'll use Richard Phillips as an example. Whilst I've never called him my mentor, I speak to him every week and I sound ideas off him all the time. And it doesn't have to
Yeah.
be a CISO or someone super technical to be a mentor. It can be someone that you trust their judgment, you've got time for, and you can have more than one, I suppose, is my comment.
Yeah, I agree, and I would say it's also in some ways important to have ones that have different viewpoints, right? If they're
Yes.
both if they're both in security and in CISOs and both pen testers, they're going to have very similar thoughts about whatever question they're asking. If you have someone who's a compliance person and someone who's a pen tester, they're going to have very different views on the world, right? Or someone who's in sales or whatever, right? So it's more important to find someone whose values align with you, and that you feel you can trust to help give you some guidance, right? So I have mine are very different, right? One is a AWS expert who lives out in California. The other guy, he's a senior GRC compliance person living in Kansas, right?
Yeah.
They're nothing alike. Their jobs are nothing alike, but I both value them because I trust them. Our values are very similar. I know they've had good success, and I know they have my best interest at heart. So when I come to them with a problem, I know I'm going to get good advice and get something maybe I won't think of myself.
And that's the key thing, isn't it? Things that you don't think of yourself as well. I think the one thing I've learned, and I suppose from my mistakes, is that I was convinced that I was an entrepreneurial genius for years, and in reality I wasn't, and I tried to do everything myself. And I think, again, realizing you're much stronger with a good team around you of people who have got other skills is a lesson well learned early doors. And I mean, we're over time, Joe. It's been so much fun. Really, really appreciate your time today. Have you got any final words for people before we wrap things up?
No, just know you're not in it alone. Find your community and just move forward, and you'll be good.
Yeah, Joe, it's been absolutely amazing. Everyone who's watched, again, thank you so much for jumping in the comments and making it interactive. It's much appreciated. For those of you that haven't, please do like and subscribe to the content. We're approaching 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, which my 13-year-old son tells me is pretty good in 12 months. And it also means, I think, at some point we get £1.50 a week from YouTube for ad revenue in the future, which we can put back into the community. So appreciate your help on that. Secondly, if you're not a member, please do come along and join the InfoSec Live community. It's absolutely free, about 3,000 of us, lots of people in there every day sharing best ideas and practice. And finally, I'll see you all again, if you're free, in an hour's time, back with Roger Grimes of Know Before and Aaron Lax, who's a sysadmin, funnily enough, Joe, and we are talking all about the quantum future, or the impact of quantum tech. I think an area perhaps that isn't talked about much in our industry. And my own concern there is all of a sudden we're going to be faced with lots of problems and no one's done any prep on it. So be interesting to see from a novice's point of view who doesn't really understand quantum computers what the problems are later. And with that, everyone, I'll play you out with a stinger. Joe, it's been a pleasure. See you all soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.